to the latest episode of the Azure On Air podcast. We're at the Integrate Summit on day 2. I've grabbed Mick Badran, who Mick's always one of my favourite speakers because he always talks about interesting stories. He always throws a few jokes in there as well, and his jokes are much better than mine. I wanted to chat to Mick about his session this week where Mick talked about healthcare and about how AI and integration are playing together. So we'll go into that in a second. But firstly, Mick, thank you for joining me on the podcast, and I really appreciate that you've come all the way from Sydney to join us here. Mick's one of a contingent of about 4 or 5 people who've come from Australia, so it's a big deal to travel all that distance to join us and share their knowledge. So thanks, Mick.
Pleasure. And the jet lag has just dissipated as I'm here talking to you. And, you're very kind. You're very kind, my friend.
So Mick, for those who haven't met Mick before, Mick's an old school BizTalk guy, I guess is the way to say it. I used to follow Mick's blog before I ever met Mick, back when he used to work at Breeze. So tell us a little bit about your journey, Mick, and how you got to where you are today.
Yeah, BizTalk. So way back in early beginning of 2000, really. Passion for technology and integration just sort of fell in my lap, really, around a lot of development, a lot of training and teaching, but integration was predominant. And then this product BizTalk came along, and it evolved, and I evolved and embraced it and found a niche. So I ran for 18 years an integration company, Breeze, which was centred around BizTalk solutions in Australia, and we got presented with all sorts of different types of scenarios and systems, and a couple of notable ones was taking an online high volume transactional company to the cloud before the cloud was in 2008, before the cloud was even born. And as a Microsoft partner, that won us a global award, and I actually had a lunch with Satya. Back then, and so it's been an amazing journey. And the thing that I like about integration is that no 2 days are the same. So since then, I sold into a public listed company, stayed there for 2 years on the executive, and went into startup land, and really love in-home energy, and recently been healthcare. Yeah. So I love just the size and being able to make decisions and the agility and things like that. So
I think one of the things I always enjoy chatting to you about, Mick, was for as long as I know you, you always seem to get the cool projects that we're going to be doing in 2 or 3 years' time. And I feel that's been a real theme with you over the years. And then when you're talking today, we've got the product teams at Microsoft telling us about their AI investments, but then you're talking about a real world project using AI stuff, using integration, and it's kind of like already using what the product teams want us to use in a year's time, which I think is exciting to hear how you got on. Yeah. Because the things we learn from you, I think, are going to help us when we do the same projects in the future.
Yeah, I think, I guess as I've gotten older, I've become lazier. So I'm a lazy developer, and so I'm always looking for tools. I'm looking for ways. We always say it, not to reinvent the wheel. And certainly AI was one of those areas back then, cognitive services, when I first started the journey. And I'd always been fascinated with machine learning and the modelling and various things, bits and pieces that come up around that, and set up web services and had request responses. But really, they were incremental changes, where what we're seeing now is certainly, I think, the AI revolution. And as I'd framed it in my talk just gone, I think it's a calculator at this stage. I think it's the AI calculator that does a certain set of functions. These are high-level functions now of summarization and translation and so on. And how are we best going to use that in the most efficient way? And I think, the Microsoft folks they're certainly leading the charge by leaps and bounds in the AI space. And how can we best, where I come from is, I've looked at that, and that's the hello world. But let's say you're 6 months on, what are you doing? Because a lot of those techniques and things aren't as applicable in real world necessarily.
Yeah.
To what you're finding at the coalface, and a lot of I suppose the more evolved offerings hadn't been there when I first started from healthcare, and so I was in a healthcare startup, and I thought, well, I'm going to use AI, and like the rest of the world, let's go and use AI. And the next question is, well, what are you going to use it for? And that's the horse before the cart. And so what I didn't want to do was sort of have this exposure where AI is still being proved, still proving its trustworthiness, and is the answer correct? Is it not? Do I have to validate it? And I think we're at this generation where the output will look at and go, no, that's not quite right, or I'm going to tweak this and that. Whereas you look at the younger folk, and they're just going to accept it blindly. Mm-hmm. So there is an element of responsibility that we need to get this right, or we need to point out, where these inconsistencies are. So certainly in healthcare, given the amount of compliance and regulation and so on, because you don't want to have an output that says you're fine and dandy, whereas you should be off seeing a doctor. So that was certainly something I wanted to steer well clear of. It's certainly not any application, any intention. What I wanted to do was to, when I was a kid, my mum had all these Encyclopedia Britannicas up on the shelf, and so if you had some sort of concept like moon rocks or a cricket or a certain type of ocean wave, you'd go and look it up and find out a bit more about it, and it brought it to life and it made it more colourful. So that was the route that I wanted to take with healthcare, and what's the best way to leverage it? How can I do it cost effectively? And so that in the healthcare world, if, for example, the solution that I had collected vitals and things, and passed it on to doctors and gave that, closed the gap between the remoteness, being at home and being in front of a healthcare professional with sort of a Zoom type call and things. And so I wanted to really sort of say, well, if we're taking blood pressure, what does 140 over 70 mean? Mm-hmm. And it might just be, let's not worry about it, in terms of the systolic and your blood pressure numbers. It might be, in layman's term and common sense, we might say, well, 120 over 80 is good. For you, that's okay. Now, that's not the decision it's meant to make. What I wanted to find out was, well, can we go to that Encyclopedia Britannica book? Can we find a colourful passage that tells us a little bit more about it? Why does that top number, if it keeps going up, impact and imply, lesser health? What does that mean? And so being able to sort of go in there and find that sort of stuff out, that the top number is the pressure and the arterial pressure and puts pressure on the walls, and it makes sense, not just I just heard this and I learn it by rote. And so then the low number, well, does the low number impact? Because some people have a blood pressure, that low number of 60 or 50. And so is that really something, is that significant? And so being able to use AI to really drill into these things and not make a decision, but the decision's been made. What we're doing is finding more out about that subject matter, so that, let's say it's, and no two answers are the same type thing, and let's say it's a little bit left or a little bit right and not quite bang on centre, it doesn't really have a huge impact. It's more of an informative thing that, nice to know, thank you. Now I can go and have a more intelligent conversation with my healthcare professional and, have a really constructive conversation.
Like in the place where your startups are you viewing the role of AI being in that kind of Dr. Google space where I would, as a patient, use it before I go to the doctor, or do you view it more in the assistant, or, co-pilot for the healthcare professional kind of space?
I think it can be in both areas. For example, I think the functions that it does really, really well is that translation, that summarization. Tell me what this 100-page document is, summarize it for me in 5 paragraphs, let's say. Yeah. And I might keep that as metadata somewhere in a database or in a store that I can work with. And so, a very practical example was a medical company came to me and said, well, we've got all these contracts for our medical equipment and our staffing. We don't know anything about them. There's 40,000 of them. They're in Spanish. And can you help us? Mm-hmm. And when I first started, I thought, well, certainly AI's got to help me on this. Mm. So what I did was craft the prompts to be able to work with it and say, translate this to English for me. And that was quite costly in terms of money across these 40,000 documents. So I didn't want to keep doing that every day or on demand. And I then, as I evolved this, I then said, in that English version, summarize it for me, because some of these are long, some of them are short, and they're about different pieces of equipment, and they're about people and different roles and things. And so what I then did was extract out some key parameters out of all of these. So tell me when the starting date was, the expiry date, and what are some of those key parameters that were set. So 3% or 5%, what some of these numbers are, and just keep them over on the side. Mm. And that way you can put a portal over the top of that, a dashboard type scenario, and you can then be proactive so that these contracts are going to expire in 3 weeks. Get on the phone or go and contact those people. Yeah. Revolutionize the company.
Yeah.
And so that is not so much, I think Star Trek and voyaging to the other side of the universe. That's just saying, hey, here's a technology that has a great capability. Let's go and use it for some practical purpose. Yeah. Now, I think, just going to that second part of your question about healthcare professionals and things, I think where I see it playing an amazing role is not to take the decision-making away from them. Still present them with all that information that they need at their fingertips. What does this look like? What's medical history like? And being able to bring all that together, because, the healthcare service market industry is very fragmented. Yeah. And if I go and see a specialist, so if I see a dentist, for example, and my gums are bleeding, that has a connection to heart health. Yeah. And if I go and see a cardiologist, I want all of that to be together in some, cohesive, accessible information package, so I can have an intelligent conversation with my cardiologist, not have everything siloed.
I think that patient notes scenario that you brought there, I think it's a really good one. So obviously, like my history in medical areas in the UK, just as a patient and a parent at the time, was things like you go to a GP or to a doctor, and then you kind of, the first thing you do is you spend 15-minute appointment, you spend 10 minutes telling them about everything that's been happening since the last time you saw them, when you might have seen 10 other professionals. And I think there's like definitely an efficiency there if the AI can say, this is what's going on with this patient, so they know before you go in to see them, and you get more value out of that appointment. I think
Exactly. I think, in a very simplistic terms, there used to be products. So Office, for example, used to be a classic where they would hide the menu options from you. And you would bring the menus down and you had to double click or whatever it was to expand it out further, and they were grayed out. And so as you're using that, you're obscured away from these different menu options. Whereas if you'd been using it for a week, you got a little bit more familiar, and you're able to then go and ask someone for a deeper and richer conversation. Now, why can't that be with our health? Mm. And so, to bring that co-pilot sort of aspect to it, yes, there's one part of, being able to have a comprehensive conversation with a healthcare professional, but, be able to sort of reason and be able to not necessarily, by no means say I know more than you, but to at least have an intelligent conversation of, I like to sort of say, well, what did you base that idea, that decision on? Yeah. Why do you want to take this course of treatment rather than something else? And being able to have, let's say, AI co-pilot to sort of come in at the foundational level and bolster up, just providing that Encyclopedia Britannica I go back to, just on your fingertips, to sort of go, well, that's really fascinating, because we've seen, and maybe it's, the problem with it today is, and the next 2 years is going to be really fascinating, really interesting journey. At the moment, they've trained it on everything and anything. So you're going to get good stuff, you're going to get whatever's on the internet, accurate, inaccurate, whatever. And what we're seeing is that research and published papers and recognised content sources of medical journals and things like this, they're all sort of putting their hands up going, yes, we could harness AI, we could harness that as being a content source and come out with our own language models, own models around this and come and use us. And
so that was really the thing where you were talking about small language models driving specific scenarios.
Yes. So, going back to, the large language model is always about, I want to know anything about everything. And that's where we all start from. But what about if we don't? What about if we want to know anything about something? So we can really narrow that focus down so that we end up getting, and I think, there's been a few presentations today where the querying capability over the top of that is quite phenomenal in terms of contextual information that you get very readily. Whereas as a developer, we're thinking about this behind the scenes, and you're like, oof, there's a fair bit of code that goes behind, show me all the work orders that were open, and were they good, were they executed properly or not? I mean, that's very interpretive, and that's what the models do really well. And so I think once we start to see all these different, medical sort of content sources being published in internal forums or external or whatnot, I think that's really going to change the face of a lot of what we do. And just to sort of finish off with in that space is that I get approached by a couple of medical places in foundations and things in Australia around rare and infectious diseases. And so there's rare diseases and there's a known set of symptoms about it, but the problem is the cases don't get connected to the foundations because there's a huge chasm between the doctor who might be taking down the history, and they might have only heard about this stuff on their final exams at university, for example. And what would be great is to really bridge that gap and put a co-pilot of sorts on their desktop.
So that's obviously where, we're almost at a time, but really for me, that's where integration facilitates the stuff in AI, and then I guess anomaly detection kind of patterns trigger back to that doctor to say, oh, this person here, you've captured these symptoms, they've got this in their history.
Yes.
That might mean there's other things going on in your local area. Boom, woof, woof, there might be a problem here.
And even narrow down that decision tree for them. And I think, and then sort of connect them up. This, you might want to talk to the foundation over here and talk to, researcher, whoever, and at least have that direct connection rather than stop there. And the doctor says, well, who do I contact? How do I know, to go that extra step? And I think, the role of AI for the healthcare professional, once they've made the decision, really sort of make it as easy as possible and frictionless to execute on that decision. So what do you want to have a referral? Do you want to write? Do you want to transcribe your progress notes? Do you want to, set up further appointments or whatever that might be? And because, you see doctors today, they walk around talking into, dictate into recorders and things, and someone types it up crazily, whereas let's just short circuit all of that. You just talk away, do what you do, get more face-to-face time, and Copilot will summarise that similar to what it does in Teams.
Yeah, that's really good. So thanks for joining us today, Mick. I think we're pretty much at time there.
Oh, always a pleasure.
I've loved seeing you again. We're looking forward to catching up tonight. Thank you for joining us, and we'd love to hear more on the podcast as you progress with the healthcare AI stuff. I think you're one of the people who can teach us some of your real-world learnings, and I'd love to talk a bit more next time about kind of some of the application of integration within that scenario.
Yes.
But have a great rest of the conference, Mick. And
thanks, Mike. Pleasure. Thank you.